Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
In October 1962, the world was thrown into the worst crisis of the 20th century, one that was closest ever to having a nuclear war. In Washington and Moscow, poor communications brought the world even closer to the brink of World War III. And in Cuba, Castro mobilized its forces in response of a possible American attack that Marines have been preparing for months. It was a battle that lasted only 14 days, but scared the whole world. A battle with an outcome that would change the world. It depended on the bravery of two men, Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Ever since the Bay of Pigs invasion, tensions between Cuba and the U.S. had been increasing, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had decided in April of 1962 to place intermediate-range missiles in Cuba. The buildup of these offensive weapons in Cuba started in mid-July of 1962. The United States had been monitoring the shipping activity to Cuba, and on August 29th, a U-2 reconnaissance flight revealed the presence of SA-2 SAM sites. It was stated that these missiles were in fact not offensive.
Day 1, Monday, October 15th, 1962. Another U-2 reconnaissance flight over Cuba by Richard Haser on October 14th had shown 6 much larger missiles than what was originally thought to be. They immediately knew it would involve the president.
Day 2, Tuesday, October 16, 1962. The president was informed immediately, and it was clear that the Soviets had been purposely deceiving the president. The missiles had a range of 1,100 miles, capable of striking the major population areas in the United States. The missiles were not yet operational, but they soon would be, as Marshall Carter, deputy director of the CIA, said. The president picked a group of trusted government officials to advise him. This group was referred to as the XCOM. The priority was to prevent the missile warheads from reaching Cuba.
Day 3, Wednesday, October 17, 1962. To maintain secrecy of their knowledge, Kennedy followed their planned schedule. In the XCOM meetings, they suggested bombing Cuba. The planned airstrike would have wiped Cuba off the planet. On this night, the military also discovered that what they thought were SS-4 missiles were actually SS-5 missiles that could strike nearly all of the United States.
Day 4, Thursday, October 18, 1962. On this day, President Kennedy attended a previously scheduled meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. The U.S. didn't know if Soviets knew of the photos taken showing evidence of the missiles. Gromyko said that Soviet aid was solely for the purpose of contributing to defense capabilities of Cuba and the development of its peaceful democracy. In response, Kennedy restated what he had said on September 4th, saying that the U.S. would not tolerate offensive weapons in Cuba. The XCOM was meeting inside of a ball held in Gromyko's honor, and some members of the XCOM suggested a blockade. At the White House, Kennedy had 2 speeches drafted for October 22nd, one announcing a blockade and the other one announcing an airstrike. Kennedy had not made his choice yet.
Day 5, Friday, October 19, 1962. Kennedy still couldn't decide which plan to use, and he had to leave for a campaign trip. When he got back, he liked the idea of a blockade because it allowed the U.S. to start with minimal activity and increase the pressure as needed. However, his final decision would not be made until the next day. Day 6, Saturday, October 20th, 1962. The XCOM discussed speeches, and Kennedy did not finalize his decision yet.
Day 7, Sunday, October 21st, 1962. Kennedy met with his top advisors to discuss the missiles. The airstrike would take out all the missiles they knew about, but would have 10,000 to 20,000 casualties. Kennedy decided to do the blockade. He used the word quarantine instead of blockade, because a blockade, as defined under the international treaties, is an act of war. Quarantine is an attempt to keep something unwanted out of an area. After the speech, the press wanted to know about the situation in Cuba, but Kennedy asked the reporters to remain quiet and the newspapers to tone down their coverage of Cuba. Another U-2 flight showed rapid assembly of missiles.
Day 8, Monday, October 22nd, 1962.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in full great care, never upsetting the precarious status quo, which ensured that these weapons would not be used in the absence of some vital challenge. Our own strategic missiles have never been transferred to the territory of any other nation under a cloak of secrecy and deception. And our history, unlike that of the Soviets since the end of World War II, demonstrates that we have no desire to dominate or conquer any other nation or impose our system upon its people.
Almost 300 Navy ships set sail without specific orders yet. Military alert was raised to DEFCON 3, and the instructions were given to be ready to launch missiles within a minute of the president's address to the nation. Kennedy began his speech at precisely 7 p.m. Jet fighters took off from a base in Florida, so the U.S. would be ready if Castro decided to respond militarily. The speech Kennedy gave informed the Americans and the people all over the world that what the U.S. has decided to do about the missiles in Cuba. Earlier in the day, a copy of the speech had been sent to Khrushchev. Khrushchev became infuriated and sent a response to Kennedy stating it was a threat to peace. In response to Kennedy's speech, Castro mobilized all of Cuba's military forces.
Day 9, Tuesday, October 29, 1962. Kennedy ordered 6 Crusader jets to be flown at a low-level reconnaissance mission. The planes brought back stunning close-up pictures of the missile sites and showed that the Soviets were testing missiles for launch. The Organization of American States, or OAS, unanimously approved of the quarantine. These countries realized that they too were threatened by the missiles. The quarantine was to take effect at 10 a.m. the next day, October 24th. By the end of the day, the quarantine line, 800 miles from Cuba, was already lined with American ships. Later, President Kennedy sent Robert Kennedy to talk with Ambassador Dobrynin. Dobrynin responded that there were no offensive weapons in Cuba. The meeting was to be cabled to Khrushchev, but communication was not very fast, so the president decided to give Khrushchev more time and move the quarantine back to 500 miles.
Day 10, Wednesday, October 24th, 1962. The Exxon met at the exact time the blockade began. The order was to communicate with Soviet vessels. If they didn't stop, they were to take action. Some of the major concerns were the submarines, and the possibility that Khrushchev had not had the time to communicate with his ship captains. At 10:25 though, the ships turned around and headed back. Everyone breathed with a sigh of relief, for the crisis was not over. On this day, the military alert was raised to DEFCON 2, the highest level in U.S. history. Khrushchev sent another letter saying that the U.S. is not in fact declaring a quarantine, but rather threatening to use force if necessary. Khrushchev also wrote that they would be forced to take measures considered necessary to protect Cuba their rights.
Day 11, Thursday, October 25, 1962. U.S. Secretary General of the United Nations had proposed a pause in the crisis to Kennedy and Khrushchev. The Soviets stopped shipping for 2 weeks, and the Americans would suspend the quarantine for an equal amount of time. This offer was turned down because it would allow the Soviets to continue preparations on the missiles already in Cuba. Still avoiding war, Kennedy sent U.S. Ambassador Aldi Stevenson to confront the Soviets. This time he showed reconnaissance photos of the missile sites. The photographs were unmistakable evidence of Soviet presence in Cuba. Later at 5 p.m., CIA director indicated that some of the missiles were now fully operational.
Day 12, Friday, October 26, 1962. During the 10 a.m. XCOM meeting, Kennedy said that the quarantine alone cannot force the Soviet government to remove its offensive weapons. There's no halt in the development of the missiles, and they were attempting to camouflage the missiles. Kennedy now believed that only invasion or a trade for missiles in Turkey would work. At lunchtime, the KGB station chief requested a meeting with ABC News. So he proposed dismantling of the Soviet bases under UN supervision in exchange for a public pledge from the US not to invade Cuba. Since Foman was a high-ranking officer, the US assumed that the proposal was an official one from Khrushchev. Accounts from the Soviet side, however, suggest Foman's proposal was not in fact authorized by Moscow. The most important thing that happened on this day, a letter from Khrushchev himself, stating that the Soviets will not carry armaments to Cuba if the US will not invade Cuba and will not support forces intending to invade Cuba. Later, without XCOM known, Robert Kennedy met with Dobrin again. Kennedy offered to introduce the Turkish missiles into a settlement. The offer would be considered.
Day 13, Saturday, October 27, 1962. This was the worst day of the crisis. One U-2 was shot down, and another was chased by MiG fighters. The plane that was shot down was hit by a SAM missile. The order to launch it was not from Khrushchev, and he was now worried that he was losing control of the forces. If the U.S. were to strike Cuba, it would be no later than Monday the 29th. Kennedy chose to wait for another plane to be shot down before doing anything. As the planes flew, Cuban forces fired. With each flight, the Americans were gaining valuable information for an invasion Castro believed only to be 24 to 72 hours away. A letter from Khrushchev said that they would remove missiles from Cuba, but the U.S. representatives will publicly declare the removal of missiles in Turkey. The XCOM did not know why Turkey was now in the agreement. Robert Kennedy's discussion was not revealed to the XCOM because they were afraid of the information being leaked out. Kennedy decided to only respond to the first letter and drafted a response. The secret deal was made saying the U.S. would remove the missiles in Turkey, but it would not be a public deal. There was also a deadline saying that if they didn't remove the missiles, the U.S. would remove them. Soviets just didn't know what the deadline was. At 8:05 p.m., Kennedy released his response to Khrushchev's latest proposal. Cuba would agree to remove the weapon systems, and the U.S. would remove the quarantine measures and assure against invasion of Cuba.
Day 14, Sunday, October 28, 1962. Kennedy was gonna make an address to the nation at 5 p.m. Khrushchev feared that the address could be an announcement that an invasion was underway. Khrushchev was not prepared to start a war, therefore, he immediately rushed a letter to the broadcasting station, hoping it would reach Kennedy before 5 p.m. This letter ended the crisis, relieving many. Tensions eased, but the ordeal was not yet over. Castro tried to halt the removal of these missiles, but eventually backed down. Eventually, everything was returned to normal. Missiles and planes were dismantled, and the quarantine was ended.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a terrifying experience for the entire world. The fact that the entire world could have changed in such a short amount of time is also one significant fact that should be considered by everyone, everywhere. In the matter of 14 days, millions of people's lives were at stake. Think before you do, like Kennedy, or there might not be a lot of things left to do it on.